Congressman Tom McClintock joins us from Washington, D.C., longtime friend of the Armstrong and Getty Show, like a knight of old standing up against wasteful government spending. Hey, Tom, how are you?
Just fine, thanks, guys.
Good, good. Hey, listen, we want to talk about the whole SEC financial thing and all that, but we could take calls until 10 o'clock tonight and never have an open line talking about this Arizona law to deal with illegal immigrants. And I'm curious, what's your take on it, given the utter failure of the federal government to enforce immigration law?
Well, somebody's got to enforce it. It's not as if they've adopted some new immigration law. All they've done is decide to enforce the existing immigration law that the federal government refuses to enforce. I mean, it's hardly a radical suggestion that if an officer on a routine traffic stop encounters a driver who's got no driver's license, no passport, and doesn't speak English, that maybe it's reasonable to ask if that individual's here illegally.
And that's the current federal law.
Yeah. Oh, and not only that, it was an integral part of the Amnesty Act of 1986. You remember we had 3 million illegal immigrants in the country. We were told we can't deport all of these folks. We have to give them a path to citizenship. And Ronald Reagan signed the bill that did that. The day after he signed that bill, there were 0 illegal aliens in the country. Every one of them had been legalized. But the other half of that equation was we are going to secure the integrity of our borders, and we're going to make it illegal for illegal aliens to be hired in the United States, and all of those promises were simply ignored. And now we have as many as 20 million illegal aliens in the country.
Tom, you are a Republican, though I know you're a bit mavericky, as Republicans go. What is it with the Republican Party? Why don't they stand up loud and clear and say, time to end this? Is it that they're getting big checks from big industry that employs the cheap labor?
No, on the contrary, I think you're seeing Republican voices being raised on this issue and have been for some time. I mean, look at Tom Tancredo, who raised the alarm over the past decade. Look at people like Jeff Flake from Arizona.
But President Bush with the Democrat.
Look at the Arizona state legislature and the Arizona governor who have stepped into the breach and taken this action.
But
those are Republicans.
What kept President Bush and a Republican Congress and a Republican Senate from doing something about it then?
Well, it's a phenomenon we call the rhinos, the Republicans in name only. We had a lot of them controlling this party for a long time, and they did exactly the opposite of what they'd promised. They promised to control the borders, they promised to reduce the deficit, reduce spending, and they did exactly the opposite. The good news is, in 2006 and 2008, most of those guys were turned out of office, and they've been replaced by conservatives who are dedicated to restoring the confidence of the American people in those core Republican ideals of limited government, of individual freedom, and of returning the federal government to its core responsibilities to protect the integrity of our borders.
Well, I don't know if you've seen the polling, but this Arizona law is overwhelmingly popular nationally and obviously in the state of Arizona.
Well, and I'll bet, I haven't seen any polling on this, I'll bet it is in California as well. You know, again, a big portion of our budget mess is the fact that we spend an estimated $10 billion a year providing free services to illegals that are overwhelming our public schools, our public hospitals, and our prisons. In fact, the L.A. County Sheriff a few years ago did a census of his prison population and discovered 40% of the inmates were illegal aliens.
40%.
That's incredible.
By the way, your old buddy Darrell Steinberg says California needs to boycott Arizona. Do you have any comment on that?
They're cheering in Arizona.
That's not a good comment.
I just wish Darrell Steinberg and his ilk would boycott California as well.
All right. So, listen, I know you want to talk about the so-called financial reform deal that Chris Dodd's trying to push. Sounds like the creation of a brand new giant bureaucracy to me. What do you think?
Well, worse than that, I think it institutionalizes all of this too-big-to-fail nonsense and the notion that risky behavior ought to be protected by taxpayers. And I know they deny it vigorously, but it is there in black and white in the bill for everybody to see. There's a permanent $50 billion bailout fund whose sole purpose is to protect the folks who make bad investment decisions, and then on top of that, an open line of credit from the Treasury for the same purpose.
Where would that money come from, that $50 billion?
Well, it's supposed to be assessed by the on the investment firms, but that, of course, is passed right in the banks, and that, of course, is passed right along to us as consumers through higher fees. So ultimately, it's paid for by consumers, and worse than that, it's paid for by the people who make good investment decisions to hold harmless the people who make bad investment decisions.
Right.
And the most important discipline against the kind of recklessness that collapsed the economy last year is that if you make a bad decision, you've got to live with the consequences. If you make a bad loan, you eat the loan. If you take out a loan you can't afford, you lose your investment and you go away sadder but wiser.
That's my objection to the whole thing, is that even if in quotes, the banks fund this fund for themselves, it's an insurance fund for people who make lunatic decisions that cause them to fail. That as you say, it perpetuates the too big to fail thing, which I think is a horrible doctrine.
Well, we took the discipline out of the housing market with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. We told lenders, go ahead, make all the risky loans you want. In fact, we insist on it. And don't worry, the government will buy up all of those bad loans. And when those loans turn bad, taxpayers were left holding the bag. Now they want to do this with the rest of the credit market. That is insane.
I don't remember your position. Was your position let these guys fail from the beginning?
Absolutely. I mean, we have whatever happened to the simple notion of bankruptcy. If a company made a bad decision and the company collapsed, well, the management was fired, the investors went away sadder but wiser, and the remaining assets were sold off to either wiser companies or were reorganized under wiser management. That was a system that worked. It worked well. It disciplined bad behavior, and it held taxpayers harmless for decisions that they weren't involved with.
Well, and you know what makes me nuts? Congressman Tom McClintock is on the line. If a local bank fails, Tom, who loses the hardest? Who loses immediately and completely?
The investors and creditors, and by the way,
the fat cats who own the bank, who screwed up the bank. Exactly,
and that's another concern that I have with this is the expanding role of the Federal Reserve, and whose sole mission ought to be to maintain the stability of the currency. It is not in a position to supervise vast liquidations of companies. That's the role of the bankruptcy courts.
But the point I was driving at is with these big, quote, too big to fail banks, the big guys who run it are the first guys who are bailed out and kept going.
Yeah, which, by the way, is why Goldman Sachs is supporting this bill. It gives the government power to anoint favored companies like Goldman Sachs with the designation too big to fail. That is, they're now backed with the full faith and credit of the United States taxpayer. Now, that puts every competitor without that title at a distinct disadvantage. I mean, where are you going to put your money? With a gritty little startup firm where you bear the risk of failure, or with Goldman Sachs that absolutely cannot fail because taxpayers are there to bail them out?
What about the idea of something being too big to fail? Do you just not believe that is a reality? That you can have an institution that's so big that if it fails, it's going to doom us all.
If it's too big to fail, then it is sure as hell too big for the American taxpayers to bail out.
Too big to exist.
Yeah. I like that. Tom McClintock is on the line. What was I going to ask you? Dang it, it was a great question, too. Oh, hey, are you a Ron Paul fan? Because I think he's brilliant, but comes off as a crazy old man about 30% of the time.
I am a big Ron Paul fan, and I've gotten to know him here in the Congress, and he's not a crazy old man. He makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. We've got a clip at ArmstrongandGettyRadio.com where he's debating Chris Matthews, and he comes off like a rock star. I love that clip. But.
Oh, yeah. Even when I disagree with him, I've got to take very, very seriously what he says because he has thought it out. He's based it on sound, fundamental constitutional principles. I don't agree with him on some of his foreign policy stands, but others you really make you stop and think.
Tom McClintock, Congressman, 4th District, California, old friend of the Armstrong and Getty Show. Go get him, Congressman.
Well, thanks, guys. Thanks for having me.
All right, we'll talk to you again soon.
How many people know?
Still waiting for that phony appointment to some board or park ranger out something or other. I don't know.
Even with 60% of people approving of the Arizona law. That's
ambassador
nationally.
To Idaho. Do we have ambassadors? Well, I'm sorry, what?
Even with nationally 60% of people approving of the Arizona law.
Yeah.
How many people know that there's already a federal law that says
exactly the same thing?
Exactly the same thing. How many people know that?
I think if 100% of people knew that, 85% of Americans would be in favor of this law.
Right.
You hear that, Daryl? You liar.